So good evening, everybody. Thank you so very much for joining us. I'm Andrea Miller. I'm the founding board member for the Center for Common Ground. If you are new to the Center for Common Ground, we are the home of several different campaigns. We're the home of the Reclaim Our Vote campaign, Students for Justice, Vote Equality. And our newest campaign is our democracy centers. And as you can see, we have a number of them all around the South. As we get closer to the general elections, you will start to see us putting up billboards all over the southern states where we're working, and we're going to be working in 9 states. And then you'll hear about the notorious RBG as she travels around to our various democracy center events. The Center for Common Ground has a very simple mission. We were founded to educate and empower underrepresented voters in voter suppression states so that they can engage in elections and advocate for their right to vote. A quick thank you to our board, Reverend Rodney Sadler, Dr. Gabby Lemus, Deepak Puri, Katie Hornung, and yes, I'm on the board. I also want to do a very brief shout out to our national partners, the RAC, Religious Action Center on Reform Judaism, the UU The Vote campaign of the Unitarian Universalist United Church of Christ, the Workers' Circle, American Ethical Union, and Faithful Democracies. And then our own internal campaign, Students for Justice, Movement Labs, Vote Equality US, the Democracy Labs, and a longtime partner, Black Voters Matter. Again, for people who are new, in 2020, our 44,000 volunteers, courtesy of so many of our faith partners, indivisibles, and sister districts, sent 14 or contacted 14 million voters. We sent 9.4 million postcards, 2.9 million text messages, and made 1.7 million phone calls. 2020 was not a federal election year, so the numbers were considerably smaller, and we did our work in Virginia, Georgia, and Mississippi. We contacted 2 million voters, sent 1 million postcards, 1 million text messages, and made over 107,000 phone calls. Now, this is our work for 2022. This is where we're going to be working. These are the races that we are going to be impacting. So the very first state is Texas, which has a primary on March 1. Next, North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama all have May primaries. North Carolina could be pushed back, but right now they're looking at May 17th. In June, we have Virginia, which has House races, and we also have South Carolina. And then in August, we have Arizona and Florida. And our new state bringing up the rear is Louisiana, which is on November 8th. Yes, that is when we have the Louisiana primary. It is November 8th. The Louisiana general will actually be in December. One thing I want you to notice about 3 of our states, Texas, Florida, and Louisiana, are already majority minority states. So if there was any question in your mind why we are seeing the incredible voter suppression in those states. This is why. Now, our newest campaign, we started it in very late 2020, and it is continuing, is our Democracy Center campaign. People who have been with us for a long time know that originally we were an entirely virtual organization. We are now moving so that we also have an on the ground arm. Our democracy centers are located in BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, where more than 55% of eligible voters, these are registered voters who, if the election were held tomorrow, they could vote in it, where more than 55% of eligible voters no longer choose to vote. Our democracy centers are local resources, and they do ongoing year-round civic engagement work. Our democracy centers, you can see this map on our website, currently are in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. One of the important things I always like to make certain that people understand is when we are working with voters who say, my vote doesn't matter, they're not really talking about candidates, and they're not talking about stolen elections. It reflects a lot of frustration with the idea that no matter who they vote for, their community pain points never change. When we talk about community pain points, each democracy center is very, very localized. And they tell us this is what is hurting in our community. So when they go out and they are knocking on doors, they approach elections not so much as popularity contests between candidate A and candidate B, but these are real issues in our communities, and we need champions who will work with us to right these wrongs. We will be expanding the democracy center locations in 2022. Working with the Atlanta NAACP and the Southwest Georgia Project, it is our goal to be in 19 counties in Georgia. The counties that are listed here represent 2 million Black voters. We will also be opening democracy centers in Florida, Texas, Arizona. We will be expanding what we have in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And then we will also be opening up in Louisiana. There is a book that was written about the work that we did in Georgia. It's called The Georgia Way, and it is available on our website for you to download. Many of you know Ray McClendon that we've worked with from the Atlanta NAACP, and you remember our guest writer, Steve Rosenfeld. They are the main authors of How to Win an Election in the South. Ray talks about team unity, which is what they have worked on building in Georgia through partnerships with the Divine Nine, the Black fraternities and sororities, Black Voters Matter. These groups that are on the ground will be utilizing the technology and the tech expertise that Center for Common Ground brings. And since our guest is here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop talking, and I am going to invite Gabe to talk about our phone banks that are currently up and running for Texas. So, Gabe?
Yeah, sure. So we have phone banks going into Dallas County right now. We're calling black voters over the age of 65, and we're encouraging them to vote early. We have passed the point where vote by mail is something we're encouraging because of the amount of time it takes to request an absentee ballot. Um, and yeah, so you can join one of our guided phone banks on Tuesday or Thursday. I'll post the link in the chat in a little bit. I have to pull it up. Um, or maybe Justin will before I can. Justin just posted the link to our phone banks page where you can sign up for a national guided phone bank, or you can train yourself and make calls on your own time. So a lot of the power of our phone banks is that people don't need to be making calls during one of these events. You can just make calls whenever it works for you. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to check out that link that he just posted. Also just posted the Mobilize link to sign up for one of our national guided phone banks.
All right, thanks a lot, Gabe. We are currently working to get texting restarted. We found that the carrier was blocking our text. So, what we're going to do is tomorrow I will have a small phone bank going up where it will only be targeted at voters 55 to 64, where we are going to see all the bad numbers. Is it really with the younger voters who obviously very frequently change their cell phones? So, Gabe, we're going to join you in working with those older voters who potentially have more stable phone numbers. So we're going to see if that works, because the phone banks we had been doing to voters over 65 for vote by mail didn't have a problem. When we went to the 18 to 64, boy, did we have a problem. So we're going to be working with PDI to see, is it really just those bad numbers? And what I'd like to do now is I want to introduce a very wonderful volunteer who has done so much work with Center for Common Ground. I want to bring up Carol Rizzolo, who will be good enough to introduce our very special guest tonight. Carol.
Well, thank you, Andrea. That's quite a compliment, quite a statement, given the incredible number of volunteers who are extraordinary in this group. I am delighted to introduce my friend Mondaire Jones. Mondaire, it's really good to see you, and I'm so glad you could make the time to be with us tonight. It's fantastic. So Mondaire is serving his first term as a congressman from New York's 17th district, which is all of Rockland County and parts of central and northern Westchester County. So it's just above Manhattan, for those not familiar with this part of the country. Representative Jones was raised in Section 8 housing and on food stamps in the village of Spring Valley in that area by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to provide for their family. After graduating from Stanford University, like, how the hell do you get across the country? That's what I want to know. But Rep. Jones worked in the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Legal Policy, where he vetted candidates for federal judgeships and worked to reform our criminal legal system to make it more fair and equitable. And he later graduated from Harvard Law School. Prior to running for Congress, Rep. Jones worked as a litigator in private practice, where he was awarded the Legal Aid Society of New York. There must be some for his some award for his pro bono service investigating claims of employment discrimination and helping families who were defrauded during the Great Recession to recover funds. Subsequently, he served as a litigator in the Westchester County Law Department. Rep. Jones began his activism in high school through the Spring Valley NAACP Youth Council. He would go on to serve on the NAACP's National Board of Directors. He's the co-founder of the nonprofit Rising Leaders Incorporated, which teaches professional skills to underserved middle school students in 3 American cities, and previously has served on the board of the New York Civil Liberties Union. As a member of the Judiciary Committee now, Rep. Jones continues his lifelong advocacy for civil rights and civil liberties and the strengthening of our democracy in Congress. In the Congress, Rep. Jones is fighting for COVID-19 relief, a living wage for all, universal health care, racial justice, climate action, and the restoration of the SALT deduction. He also serves as the freshman representative to the leadership in the 117th Congress, making him the youngest member of the Democratic House leadership team. Also serves as the deputy whip for the Congressional Progressive Caucus and co-chair of the LGBTQ Equality Caucus. He currently lives in Rockland County and resides in Westchester and Mondaire. I just could not be more delighted to see you and to have you join this group. I will turn it over to you.
Well, it is always great to see you, Carol. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you as well, Andrea, for welcoming us all to this event. And of course, my heartfelt thanks to all of you who are joining us tonight for doing your part to stand up for our democracy. As you all know, our democracy is in crisis. It faces, as you know, its greatest test since Jim Crow. And last month, the Jim Crow filibuster was used to block the voting rights legislation we urgently need in this moment, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. But we aren't giving up that easily. We will, in fact, never give up. I know you know that well, given the work that you do. We, the people, did not give up when, after we finally ended the scourge of slavery in this country, white nationalists fought back, violently unraveling Reconstruction, throwing duly elected Black people out of office, and of course, barring Black voters from the voting booth for generations. We organized in response to those actions. And progress came in fits. It took us nearly a century, but progress did come. It came in the courtroom, where Thurgood Marshall helped to end a century of legalized segregation. It came on the streets, where the March on Washington and Montgomery bus boycott produced meaningful social change. And it came in Congress, where after considerable pressure from the civil rights movement, the House of Representatives and the Senate passed the Voting Rights Act into law and overcame a filibuster to do it. Imagine that. Like you, last month, I was hoping that our story would end the same way, with a majority of senators doing the right thing. So I feel your pain right now, but I do not despair. As Sherilyn Ifill, the Director Counsel for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, stated recently, no story in the history of our quest for racial justice has ever ended with the words, "and then they gave up." Our story, the story of building a true multiracial democracy in the 21st century, is no exception. The fact is, progress isn't always linear. It's messy. There are false starts. There are setbacks, like what happened in the Senate last month. But the weight of history and the force of reason are on our side. I grew up in the Baptist church. To quote from the book of Jeremiah, "Like a fire shut up in my bones, I know that goodness will prevail." As the elders used to say, trouble don't last always. Weeping may endureth for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And look at how far we have come already. Just a few years ago, democracy reform was a pipe dream, embraced only by the most committed activists. But thanks to an overwhelming groundswell of energy, of movement building, of organizing, the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act passed the House, and it came just 2 votes short of passing the Senate. So I'm here to tell you that we are not going anywhere. We are more energized than ever to see this through. We must pick up Senate seats this fall to make filibustering voting rights legislation in the future an impossibility. So with the rest of our time together tonight, I'd like to talk to you about 3 bills I've introduced to protect and renew our democracy. The first is called the Right to Vote Act, which I am proud passed the House of Representatives last month as a key provision of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. In the nearly 250-year history of our nation, the United States has never affirmatively guaranteed the right to vote to anybody. Sure, the federal Constitution says that states cannot disenfranchise on the basis of race or sex, that states cannot disenfranchise anyone with a poll tax, and that states cannot disenfranchise people on the basis of age once they are 18 years old. But nowhere does the Constitution actually say what it should, which is that all citizens have the fundamental right that we know to be preservative of all other rights, that right being the right to vote. And that omission in the Constitution is the reason it remains so easy for states to get away with the racist voter suppression that we are seeing today. My Right to Vote Act would change that. And for the first time, the federal government would guarantee all adult citizens the fundamental right to vote. That means federal courts would be required to treat the right to vote as the fundamental right that it is. It means that no government, state, local, or federal, could make it harder to vote without proving that doing so is the least restrictive way to protect our elections. No longer could the far right use the big lie of mass voter fraud that they know does not exist in order to justify racist voter suppression. Second, I'm also proud that the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act included another one of my bills with Ruben Gallego called the Inclusive Elections Act. Last July, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brnovich damaged the most powerful remaining provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, known as Section 2. Until Brnovich, Section 2 barred states from enacting voter suppression laws that disparately impact people of color and linguistic minorities. Alongside my friend, Representative Gallego of Arizona, I introduced the Inclusive Elections Act to restore Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to its original strength. With the Inclusive Elections Act, the Voting Rights Act would once again outlaw racist voter suppression laws like the ones the court has been upholding. Third, I'd like to emphasize one crucial area of reform that the voting rights community should be more invested in: restoring balance to the Supreme Court by adding 4 justices. The fact is, our democracy would not be as vulnerable as it is today if it were not for the far-right 6-3 supermajority that dominates the Supreme Court. It is a majority that is hostile to democracy itself. It was the Roberts Court that struck down the preclearance provision of the original Voting Rights Act in the 2013 decision called Shelby v. Holder, unleashing this new wave of racist voter suppression that we've been seeing in states like Georgia and Texas. That's why I'm so proud to co-lead the Judiciary Act of 2021, which we introduced on Thursday, April 15th of last year. It would restore balance to the Supreme Court by adding 4 seats. There is precedent for this. The size of the Supreme Court has changed 7 times before in our nation's history. If we do not add 4 seats and put these hyper-partisan conservative justices in their rightful place in the minority, the court will retain the power to betray our most fundamental rights, including the right to vote. Once we pass it, they may well strike down democracy reform legislation like the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act on baseless pretext if we don't also expand the size of the court. We cannot let that happen. Unless we expand the court, decades of hard-fought progress to protect the sacred right to vote, especially for Black and brown people, will be undone. I know President Biden and my Democratic colleagues do not want that to be their legacy. Fortunately, with your help, we can make sure that they take action on this. As vital as it is that we pass comprehensive legislation to renew our democracy and restore balance to the Supreme Court, we in Congress cannot do this alone. Free, fair, and equitable elections depend on the people. Voting rights legislation and voter protection and mobilization go hand in hand. The fact that in 2020, we achieved our highest voter turnout in decades in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic is a testament to the power of grassroots organizing, advocacy, and voter protection. That is why the work you all do here at the Center for Common Ground is so darn important. There is simply no substitute for your grassroots work to make sure that everyone is engaged. Every voter can vote. Every vote is counted, and every election is certified. I wish the incredible work that you do were not as necessary as it is in the year 2022. But with our democracy on the line, your work can make the difference. We would not have any opportunity at all to pass this legislation if it had not been for people like you empowering voters across the South in 2020. And we will not have opportunities like this in the future without you. What is at stake is not just our democracy, but our capacity to solve the real crises that affect the American people each and every day. From the fight for racial justice to the fight for a habitable planet or for reproductive freedom. So now we have to press ahead. The far right is already hard at work to subvert the next elections. We have no time to waste. And together we can build the democracy we deserve. A democracy where your vote and every vote matters because we've ended the scourge of partisan gerrymandering. Where you never have to worry about whether your friends and your family are registered to vote because everyone is registered automatically. Where you don't need to justify exercising your right to vote by mail. Where teachers and yes, bartenders who aspire to run for office can mount competitive campaigns even if they don't come from money or from a political family. Where candidates for office make their case to we the people that they deserve our support rather than being anointed by billionaires and corporations. Where elections are won by uplifting voters rather than by suppressing their right to vote. That is a democracy where the American people are in charge, not a select powerful few. So I'm proud to be standing side by side with you in this fight for that democracy. Thank you again for having me this evening. And I so look forward to answering your questions tonight.
Thank you so very, very much, Representative Jones, for joining us tonight. Will you have a few moments for questions?
Yes, I will.
Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely. Josie, do you want to do the honor?
Sure, Congressman Jones, thank you so much for being here. My name is Josie, and I'm the Deputy Policy Director here at the Center for Common Ground. As you said, we are still here. We're ready to keep on going, keep on working to get out the vote for the 2022 midterms and make sure that the freedom to vote is something we address from the ground up, all the way to the Supreme Court. And with that, the first question I have, thank you also to participants who submitted these questions. The first one being, regarding the Supreme Court, wouldn't it be beneficial to set service term limits for the justices?
I so appreciate that question. You might imagine it comes up often. Let me just make the observation that I don't think the problem is that judges have life tenure. I think the problem is the kinds of judges being appointed to the Supreme Court. I'm also focused on expanding the court right now because term limits would not solve the crisis that we face in this moment. Right now, we have a court that has never struck down a voter suppression law as unconstitutional, not even once. Right now, we have a court that has twice struck down or weakened crucial components of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. Right now, we have a court that is poised to end reproductive freedom in a few months, and this has already done so in Texas, by the way, in this country, and that is making everyday life harder for working families and easier for the wealthy and the well-connected and the biggest corporations. So we can't wait for term limits to phase these justices out. In fact, because term limits would not apply to sitting justices, term limits would ironically entrench rather than limit the dominance of the right on our court. Imagine if we passed term limits before President Biden got to nominate in the Senate to confirm a replacement for Justice Breyer. So what's more, term limits are completely unprecedented and they may be unconstitutional So we can't afford to experiment, I would submit respectfully, especially when the solution is staring us in the face. By contrast, court expansion is a solution that is rooted in history. I mentioned that the size of the court has changed 7 times before in our nation's history, including to defeat white supremacy following the assassination of President Lincoln. And of course, court expansion is actually responsive to the problem at hand. There's no constitutional question that Congress may adjust the size of the court. So that's my position on term limits.
Well, that was a great answer. Thank you. So in terms of adding more seats to the Supreme Court, what is the path forward for that? What are the next steps for you, and what are the next steps for us as voters that we can take?
Well, let me just say that we have come so far. I mean, we introduced this bill, Hank Johnson and Jerry Nadler. Hank Johnson is the chair of the subcommittee on courts. Jerry Nadler is the chair of the full Judiciary Committee on which I serve. And we introduced this bill on Thursday, April 15th. And so many folks were dismissive of that idea, the idea of court expansion. Most of the folks hadn't done their research yet. And now we're up to 50 people in Congress supporting it. Most recently, Elizabeth Warren signed on. But we've also got a majority of the American people on our side. There was a poll done in September of last year by the firm called Navigator, showing that 56% of Americans agreed with the statement that adding seats to the Supreme Court is necessary to protect reproductive rights. 90% of Democrats agreed with that statement. 61% of independents did. So we just have to keep mobilizing around this. So many of the folks who have signed on to the Judiciary Act of 2021 are folks who did so after their constituents lobbied them to do precisely that. And so I'm really proud that this movement is growing. I think that, unfortunately, as this court continues to strip away or undermine or chip away at fundamental rights, including still during this term in a few months, we're going to see that number of co-sponsors increase on the Democratic side in Congress.
Great, yeah, I think that makes sense. So everybody make sure to call up your representatives if you haven't talked to them in a while. Let them know that you are in favor of expanding the Supreme Court. This is still related, we're moving away a bit from the Supreme Court now, and just more into elections as a whole with this question, which is, in what ways do you feel elections are not inclusive, and in what ways can it be rectified? I think this is a really important question, especially considering what happened in the Senate a few weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, since 2010, states have enacted more restrictions on voting than at any time since the dawn of Jim Crow. Last year alone, 19 states passed the laws that made it harder to vote. As folks working on the front lines of voter engagement in the South, you all hardly need me to tell you that those restrictions have disproportionately excluded or burdened people of color, seniors, students, and voters with disabilities. And the fact is, racist voter suppression laws are part of a political strategy, if we are to be honest, by one major political party called the Republican Party, which has decided that since it cannot win people's votes on the merits of its ideas, it will try instead to win elections through suppressing those votes. Let me give you 2 examples. Thanks to the voter suppression law Texas passed last year, today, counties across Texas are rejecting mail-in ballot applications at unprecedented rates, some as high as 25 to 50%. And which counties are experiencing the highest rejection rates? The counties that include the state's largest communities of color, like those in Austin and Houston and San Antonio. Or take Georgia, for example. A new analysis by Ari Berman of Mother Jones found that because of the voter suppression law Georgia enacted in 2021, Georgia voters were 45 times more likely to have their mail ballot applications rejected last year than in 2020. If that had been the rejection rate in 2020, Georgia would have rejected more than 38,000 votes, more than the margin that decided the presidential election there, which was just 11,000 votes. And that's not all. Even Georgians who successfully applied for mail-in ballots last year were twice as likely to have their votes rejected when they finally cast those ballots. Again, if that had been the rejection rate in 2020, it could have decided the outcome of the presidential election. Both of these shifts have disproportionately harmed Georgians of color. Half of the mail-in ballots that were rejected under the new law that I just described in 2021 were cast by Black voters, even though Black voters make up only about a third of the electorate in Georgia. Shameless plug for my Inclusive Elections Act. It would enable voters in Texas and Georgia to get these laws struck down in court simply on the ground that they disparately impact voters of color, which was the original intent that Congress had for Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And my Right to Vote Act would allow any voter to challenge these laws simply because they make it harder to cast a vote and have that vote counted.
Yeah, I read an article recently also about a county in Georgia. Even though they didn't get rid of Sunday voting on a state level, a county just voted to get rid of it in Georgia. These are in many ways very obvious attacks against voters of color that are happening in the states. And it's a disappointing thing to see that we all need to get behind stopping. The next question I have is pretty much not really, well, we're going to build back better now, if that's okay with you. And this is the final question that I got. It's, what do you think about the idea of breaking up individual parts of Biden's Build Back Better into individual bills versus just one big bill?
Well, I think the speaker has been really clear on this point, Speaker Pelosi. Because reconciliation can only happen so many times, according to the rules, you can't break it up into smaller pieces. You can remove things from what we passed, and for which we also passed a budget resolution up to a certain amount in spending. And of course, Build Back Better is fully paid for, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Here's where I am on this. When President Biden asked House Democrats to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, or bill at the time, he also made a promise that if we did so, he would deliver the 50 votes needed in the Senate to pass the Build Back Better Act. That was his promise to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, of which I am a member. And we made good on our end of that deal. And so now we need him to do the same. At this point, we need President Biden to resume working with Senators Manchin and Sinema to figure out what they are willing to support and to strike a deal. And we are so ready to pass what is able to be negotiated. And there seems to be widespread agreement that certain key provisions, including the climate provisions, have the support that they need to pass. And we need to figure out what we can get done, and we need to get it done without delay, because time is running out. Given the constraints of the reconciliation process I mentioned, we need to craft the strongest possible bill that can get through the Senate and get it passed quickly. And we know that the American people are waiting. In the meantime, the president, I think, should use his executive authority to do things like cancel student debt, end fossil fuel industry subsidies, and so on and so forth.
I like the sound of that. Thank you again for being here. I don't know about you, but I am very excited to get back to work and call some voters in Texas, make sure people go out to the polls, because we will not let anybody stand in the way of our freedom to vote. So thank you again for being here. I will pass things over to Andrea one more time to wrap things up for the evening.
Thank you so much for having me, and please keep doing the important work that you're doing, because you're making a world of difference.
Well, Josie, thank you for running our question part. And I'm going to ask a question that I saw in the chat while the congressman is here. We don't do as much as we used to. Our C4 used to do continued digital advocacy. We do some now. The question was, is there a best way to get the attention of your elected representatives and kind of sway them toward your thinking, your way of thinking? Email, phone calls, or protest?
It is all of the above. I mean, any member of Congress worth their salt is taking stock of how many messages they receive, particularly from their constituents, but also from other people, and what those messages are, whether by email, phone. I think personalized letters probably get more attention than things that look like 100 people wrote the same thing. But we take note of that too. On a weekly basis, I get a whole spreadsheet based on how my staff has organized things. We are very data oriented, and it means something for your constituents to be the ones pushing something, as opposed to folks who don't live in your district. I will absolutely say that. It matters a lot to me. I care more about what folks in my district say than I do folks elsewhere who may have a completely different perspective from the way we're living in my district. So that's why I say, please keep at it. I mean, I mentioned in my remarks that most or many of the people who are co-sponsors of the court expansion bill are folks who only got there after they were lobbied by organizations and constituents.
We are definitely going to be putting together an alert around the Right to Vote Act and the Judiciary Act. And so expect to be getting letters. What we have found, and I've been doing work on the Hill since 2010, is that it is much easier to get people to send an email than it is to get them to call, because there's this concern. What if the office asks me questions and I don't know the answer? And regardless of how often I've explained to people, you just need to tell them that you want them to support X or you want them to oppose Y. They're not going to test you on your knowledge. So that's always been a little bit tricky. So we pretty consistently let people do it by email, but our new tools give them the option, if they're willing, you can click here and then our system will call you and then patch you through to your legislator's office. So no, it's not a robocall. It is an individual person. We provide you with a script so you can pretty much know what you're supposed to be saying, and we guide you through it. So that's what we like to do. So, Congressman, I am again going to thank you so very much for joining us tonight. I always get inspired when I hear the young members and what they're about and what they're supporting.
Thank you so much. And again, Carol, thank you for inviting me tonight. I mean, it means the world. And I'm just so inspired by the work that you do. It's really energizing for me. I got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene in my hallway. So when I get to be in community with you, it's a different vibe. All right. Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you, Mondaire. Have a good evening. Thanks again.
Thank you. All right. Now I'm going to end with just a few more calls for work. The phone banks are currently up. Nancy, do you want to talk about our upcoming postcard campaigns when we get done with Texas? Because the Texas postcards are going to need to be in the mail by Valentine's Day.
That's right, thanks. And we are actively postcarding 720,000 Black voters in Texas. We've gone through more than half the addresses, so we still have about half of them to do. Then we're going to take a break until mid-March, and we're going to start in on North Carolina, which has a primary May 17th, then Georgia, which has a primary May 24th, and then Alabama, which also has a primary May 24th. We'll probably have about 2 million addresses between mid-March and when we start sending them out, stop mailing them out, which will be mid-April. I'm sorry, early May, right before the primaries. And we'll get there a little bit earlier than mid-March if we can, but that's our promise, is mid-March.
And then for our democracy centers that are in state, we are doing a training on voter letters. This is the tool that we use to get you your addresses. So it's not just somebody sitting there copying and pasting and making a spreadsheet. We actually have software that you can use, and you can go in and say, I need X number of addresses. So that training, Nancy, is Monday the 7th at, I believe, is it 11 o'clock or 11:30?
11:30 is what Barbara
All
said.
right, yes. Yes.
And I should say too, for people who aren't in democracy centers, the rest of the country, we organize our postcard work regionally. So you will have a regional organizer in your area that can set you up with voter letters and perhaps get you postcards in a packet if they're nearby. Phone banking is a national effort. We have national guided phone banks. Texting is national, but postcarding is done basically on where you live. You'll be in a voter letters room and get postcard support from your regional organizer. And we'll be sending out lists and links for the regional organizers and postcarding and phone banking after, along with the recording.
All right. Yes, handwriting the postcard is very, very important. When people get a handwritten postcard, there is such a high probability that they are going to read it, much more so than a printed postcard, which is why we do it the way we do. We have discovered what works best with the voters that we are reaching out to. These are voters that are ignored. We do not want it looking as though it is a form anything. We are writing those voters. So yes, yes, yes. People are going, oh yeah, we're just finding out so many different things. Frank, do you have any reports that you want to give on the democracy centers? I've got a quick training report on classes that we're going to be offering soon.
Not at this moment. We're still cooking up some things, and I want to wait for them to be a little bit done. I know EC is the master of giving teasers, so I'm going to try to pull a page out of his playbook, but we do have some things that we're working on for February here for Black History Month. So stay tuned, and we will definitely keep everyone up to date and up to speed.
All right. Well, I want to let everybody know we will be announcing training courses that will be available. We are currently working on a Civics 101 course that will be customized for each of our 9 states. So it will have a federal piece, how Congress works. It will also have how elections work in your state. Many people have no idea how people end up on the Board of Elections. We will demystify that for each state. And then we will also talk about local races and what the various local positions, mayor, city council, school board, what they do. And in your state, are they elected? Are they appointed? How do those folks get in power? I will again be repeating my effective citizen lobbying course, and our folks in Georgia are going to be in Cobb County, are going to be offering that course, I believe, starting next weekend. We're revising our volunteer recruitment course. There is currently an earned media course, and we are revising our leadership development, organizing 101, and asset mapping. So those are just some of the things that will be coming probably in the middle of February, when I actually roll out what the course schedule will be. So as I mentioned, some of the courses are already done, and I will just begin offering them again. Many state houses are currently in session, and then Congress, of course, there will be opportunities to do outreach on Build Back Better, which is budget reconciliation. So that will probably really start taking shape in mid to late March. All right, so that is basically what I have. So thank you all so very much. Oh, Carrie says, and when is our next webinar? Our next webinar, where we have a special guest, will be on February 17th. There will be another Looking Forward and Federal. And our special guest will be from Washington, D.C. He will be the D.C. state rep. So he will be talking about DC statehood, because as a voting rights organization, we are definitely very sensitive to the plight of the folks who live in Washington, D.C. More than 715,000 people who don't have a senator. They should have two. And they also, while they have Eleanor Holmes Norton, they don't have a representative in Congress who can vote. So Washington, D.C., they elect their own senators and their own representative, but they don't actually have offices in Congress. So they will be there with us on the 17th of February. So I'm thrilled. We did really good tonight. So thank you all. Hopefully you will be phone banking. You will be working on your postcards, and I will be working on getting texting up and running. Probably by tomorrow afternoon will be how long it will take me, because I'm going to need to make brand new lists. So thank you for joining us, and good evening.
Bye, good night. Thank you all.